I stood in the shower, letting the warm water wash away the weight of the day, when suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open. My heart stopped. Through the frosted glass, I saw a shadow, tall and unmoving. "Alex!" I called out, my voice trembling. But it wasn't my husband. It was Ryan, his son. His eyes locked on mine, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life began to shatter. Emily had always prided herself on being the perfect wife. She and Alex were married for nearly 10 years. A picture-perfect couple with a beautiful home and a life that seemed flawless from the outside. But appearances could be deceiving. Alex's job as a corporate consultant demanded constant travel, leaving Emily alone for weeks at a time. At first, she cherished the independence, decorating their home and pursuing hobbies. But over time, the silence of the house began to feel oppressive. Nights grew longer, and loneliness became her constant companion. Ryan, Alex's son from his first marriage, moved in with them a few months ago after his mother relocated for work. At 22, Ryan was polite and respectful, though distant. He spent most of his time studying and working part-time, barely making his presence felt in the house. Emily tried her best to make him feel welcome, often cooking his favorite meals and leaving encouraging notes on the fridge before his exams. Despite her efforts, there was always an awkwardness between them, something unsaid but palpable. She chalked it up to the age gap and their unusual dynamic as stepmother and stepson. Yet, in quiet moments, she sometimes caught him watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, even when she was fully clothed. Emily dismissed it as her imagination, blaming the lack of attention from Alex for making her overly sensitive. After all, Alex barely looked at her anymore. Their marriage had become mechanical. Routine kisses and obligatory "I love yous" over hurried breakfasts before he left for another trip. Still, she held on to hope. She told herself that once Alex's schedule calmed down, things would return to normal. She just needed to be patient. But patience didn't help when she found herself face-to-face with Ryan that day in the bathroom. The moment replayed in her mind on a loop, the way his eyes lingered, the tension crackling in the air. It was an accident, she told herself. Nothing more. And yet, as she lay awake that night, her body tingling at the memory of his gaze, Emily couldn't deny that something had shifted. Something dangerous. The days that followed felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened between Emily and Ryan. She tried to act normal, slipping back into her routine of cleaning, cooking, and scrolling through social media to distract herself. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes on her in the bathroom, or the way her body had reacted. Ryan, however, was different. He seemed quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact yet always lingering nearby. Emily caught him watching her from the corner of his eye more times than she cared to admit. One evening, as she set the table for dinner, Ryan walked in. He paused in the doorway, his eyes tracing the line of her back before quickly looking away. Emily's pulse quickened. "Hey," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Hey," he replied, his voice low, almost nervous. They sat down to eat, but the tension was unbearable. Alex had left for another business trip earlier that day, and the empty seat at the table seemed to amplify the silence. "So," Emily began, her voice too loud in the stillness, "how's school going?" "It's fine," Ryan said, stabbing at his food. "Busy but manageable." "That's good." She tried to smile, but it felt forced. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, and when Ryan's eyes flicked up to meet hers, something shifted in the air. Later that night, Emily couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to have. She told herself she was imagining things, that Ryan's looks and awkward silences were just a product of her own insecurities. But then it happened again. She went downstairs to grab a glass of water, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden floors. As she reached for the faucet, she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned, and there he was, standing in the dimly lit doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "No," Emily said, gripping the counter for balance. "Just needed some water." Ryan stepped closer. "Me too," he said, though he didn't move toward the sink. Her heart pounded as he leaned against the counter, his proximity making it hard to breathe. "About the other day," he began, his voice hesitant. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Emily interrupted too quickly. "Really? Let's just forget it happened." But neither of them could forget. The next morning, Emily found herself avoiding him. She busied herself with chores and errands, but Ryan's presence lingered in her thoughts. That night, as she cleared the dinner table, he brushed past her, his arm grazing hers in a way that sent a jolt through her body. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, but Ryan didn't stop. Instead, he lingered just long enough to let her feel the weight of his presence before walking away. Emily's hands trembled as she washed the dishes, the water running over her fingers. What was happening to her? She knew this was wrong, dangerous, but the more she tried to fight it, the more it consumed her. As she lay in bed later that night, Emily couldn't ignore the truth anymore. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of awkwardness. Something was building between them, something she wasn't sure she could stop. The house felt different now, charged with an energy Emily couldn't ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch between her and Ryan lingered too long, left her skin tingling and her mind restless. She tried to keep her distance, but it was impossible. The more she avoided him, the more she found herself drawn to him. One evening, Emily was folding laundry in the living room when Ryan walked in. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair damp from a shower. He paused when he saw her, then stepped closer. "Need help?" he asked, his voice soft. "No, I've got it," she replied quickly, but her hands betrayed her, fumbling with the towels. Ryan sat down on the couch beside her anyway, too close. She could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You seem different lately," he said after a moment. Emily's breath hitched. "Different how?" "I don't know. Tense, maybe? Like something's on your mind." She forced a laugh. "It's just work. And your dad being gone all the time." Ryan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. "Ryan," she whispered, but her voice faltered when his fingers lingered against her cheek. "It's not wrong to want to feel seen," he said. "To want someone to notice you." His words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had felt invisible, ignored by Alex, left alone to keep their lives running while he traveled the world. And now, here was Ryan, looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. "I think you should go," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she didn't pull away. Ryan leaned closer. "Do you really want me to?" Emily's breath caught as his lips hovered near hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Every logical thought screamed at her to move, to stop this before it went any further. But instead, she stayed frozen, trapped between fear and desire. Their eyes locked, and then it happened. He kissed her. The moment their lips touched, Emily felt her resolve shatter. Her fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind raced with panic. This was wrong, so wrong, but she couldn't stop. When they finally broke apart, Emily's chest heaved, and Ryan's eyes searched hers. "We can't do this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, brushing his thumb across her lip. "But it doesn't feel wrong." Emily swallowed hard, her thoughts spiraling. She stood abruptly, creating space between them. "I need to think," she said, avoiding his gaze. Ryan didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and stood, his expression unreadable. That night, Emily lay awake, her body still humming from the kiss. She kept replaying the moment over and over, until the guilt finally caught up with her. What was she doing? How had she let it get this far? But the following morning, when Ryan entered the kitchen and their eyes met, she knew it wasn't over. Later that day, Emily found herself alone in the house again. She was wiping down the kitchen counter when Ryan appeared in the doorway. "Emily," he said softly. She turned, her pulse quickening. "Ryan, we can't." "Don't," he interrupted, stepping closer. "Don't pretend like you don't feel it too." Her heart pounded as he closed the distance between them. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he whispered, his voice low and rough. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "This isn't fair." "No," he agreed, "but neither is pretending we don't want this." His hands found her waist, pulling her toward him. She should have pushed him away. She should have told him to stop. Instead, she melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck. Their lips met again, hungrier this time. Emily lost herself in the moment, in the heat of his touch and the fire it ignited inside her. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "This has to stop," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Then tell me to stop," Ryan challenged, his eyes dark with desire. But she didn't. Instead, Emily turned and walked away, leaving Ryan standing in the kitchen. But not before she felt his gaze burning into her back, a promise that this was far from over. Emily couldn't focus. The tension in the house had grown unbearable, thick like smoke she couldn't escape. Every glance, every accidental brush of Ryan's hand set her nerves alight, leaving her shaken and restless. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. But what scared her more was how much she wanted to cross it again. That evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Emily sat on the couch, pretending to watch television. Her glass of wine was untouched, her thoughts consumed by the memory of Ryan's kiss and the heat that had lingered long after he left the room. She startled at the sound of footsteps. Ryan! He hesitated at the doorway, watching her. She could feel his eyes even before she turned to meet them. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but low. Emily's heart raced. "Ryan, this has to stop. It's wrong. We both know that. Then why can't you look at me and say you don't want it?" She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood, putting distance between them. "This isn't fair to your father." "My father?" Ryan took a step closer. "You mean the man who leaves you here alone for weeks at a time? The man who doesn't even see you?" "Stop it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I won't." He reached for her hand, his touch electric. "Because I see you, Emily. I see how lonely you are. How much you try to hide it. And I know you feel this too." Emily's breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she was in his arms. His lips crashed against hers, and she gave in, letting the heat between them drown out the voice in her head screaming for her to stop. They didn't hear the car pull into the driveway. The front door slammed and Emily froze, her lips still tingling from the kiss. "Emily?" Alex's voice boomed from the hallway. Panic surged through her as she pushed Ryan away. "Go upstairs," she hissed. Ryan hesitated, his eyes searching hers, but the urgency in her voice sent him scrambling out of the room just as Alex stepped in. "What's going on?" Alex asked, his eyes narrowing at the flustered look on Emily's face. "Nothing," she said too quickly. "I was just watching TV." Alex frowned. "Where's Ryan?" Emily's stomach dropped. "Upstairs, I think. Studying." Alex didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he sat down and pulled out his phone, leaving Emily to clean up the mess she had just made. But later that night, as she lay in bed beside Alex, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Ryan. The feel of his lips, the way he looked at her like she was the only person who mattered. And she knew it wasn't over. The next day, Emily avoided Ryan. She needed time to think, to figure out how to fix the mess she had created. But avoiding him only seemed to make things worse. That evening, as she folded laundry in the guest bedroom, Ryan appeared in the doorway again. "We can't keep doing this," she said before he could speak. "I know." But he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Ryan." "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't push me away." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "This isn't fair to anyone." Ryan stepped closer, his fingers brushing against her arm. "Maybe not. But it's real." And just like before, she couldn't resist him. But this time they weren't alone. A sharp knock on the door startled them both. "Emily?" It was Alex. Emily's eyes widened in panic, and she shoved Ryan toward the closet. "Don't make a sound," she whispered before opening the door. Alex stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Emily said, forcing a smile. "I was just folding laundry." Alex's gaze lingered for a moment before he nodded. "I need to talk to you about something." Emily's stomach dropped. "Okay. What is it?" "It's about Ryan." Her breath caught. "What about him?" Alex hesitated. "I don't think he's happy here. He's been acting strange lately, and I can't put my finger on it. I think maybe we need to have a talk with him." Emily forced a nod, her pulse racing. "Sure. That sounds like a good idea." Alex kissed her forehead, oblivious to the tension in the room. "We'll talk tomorrow." As soon as he left, Emily yanked open the closet door. Ryan stepped out, his face pale. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we will," he replied, his eyes dark with certainty. "And you know it." That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She knew she had crossed too many lines to turn back now. And the worst part? She didn't want to. Emily sat at the kitchen table the next morning, her coffee cold and untouched. The guilt gnawed at her, but it wasn't enough to drown out the memory of Ryan's touch, the way her body had responded to him, betraying everything she thought she stood for. Alex had already left for another business trip, leaving the house empty again. Except for Ryan. The creak of the stairs sent a jolt through her. She didn't look up as he entered, but she felt him, the tension in the air, the weight of his presence. "Morning," he said softly. Emily's hand tightened around the coffee mug. "Morning." They sat in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. She couldn't take it anymore. "This has to stop," she said, her voice sharp but trembling. "I mean it this time, Ryan." His chair scraped against the floor as he stood and moved closer. You don't mean it. I do. She stood too, but he didn't back away. No, you don't, Ryan said, his voice low. Because if you did, you wouldn't have let it happen again. And again. Tears burned at the edges of Emily's eyes. I'm married to your father. Do you love him? Ryan's question hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. The truth was she didn't know anymore. Ryan stepped closer. You're not happy with him, Emily. He doesn't see you. Not like I do. You're just a kid, she snapped, her voice breaking. I'm not a kid, he shot back, his eyes dark. Not anymore. And you know it. Emily shook her head and pushed past him, but he grabbed her wrist, stopping her. Let me go, she whispered. No, Ryan said. Not until you admit it. Admit you want me. Emily's resolve crumbled. I can't do this, she said, tears spilling over. We can't do this. But Ryan didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, his voice softer now. Then stop pretending, Emily. Stop pretending you don't feel this. She hated him in that moment. Hated him for making her want him, for breaking down the walls she had spent years building. But she hated herself more for not pulling away. Suddenly, the front door opened. Emily? Alex's voice rang out, and they jumped apart. Emily's heart pounded as she wiped at her face, trying to compose herself. In here, she called, her voice too high, too shaky. Alex walked in, his eyes flicking between the two of them. Everything okay? Fine, Emily said quickly. Ryan was just helping me with something. Ryan nodded, but his jaw was tight. I was just heading out, he said, brushing past Alex without looking back. As soon as the door closed behind him, Alex turned to her. What's going on? Emily forced a laugh. Nothing. Don't lie to me, Emily. Her stomach dropped. What are you talking about? I've been noticing things, Alex said, stepping closer. The way you've been acting. The way Ryan's been acting. You're imagining things, she said, but her voice faltered. Alex's eyes darkened. Are you sleeping with him? No. The word burst out of her, but the guilt in her voice betrayed her. Alex's face twisted with anger. Don't lie to me. Tears streamed down Emily's face. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Alex stepped back, shaking his head. How could you do this? To me? To our family? I don't know. Emily cried. I was lonely, Alex. You're never here. And he was just there. That's not an excuse. Alex roared. Emily sobbed. I know it's not. But it happened and I can't take it back. Alex stared at her for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and walking out. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house, leaving Emily alone. She sank to the floor, her body shaking as the weight of what she'd done came crashing down. She had destroyed her marriage, her family, everything. And yet, even as she sat there, broken and ashamed, a part of her couldn't stop thinking about Ryan. What was wrong with her? The house was eerily quiet now, stripped of the warmth and comfort it once held. Emily sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the half-empty glass of wine in her hands. The echoes of Alex's angry words still rang in her ears, and the weight of what she had done pressed heavily on her chest. Ryan was gone. After Alex stormed out, Ryan had packed his things and left without a word. She hadn't stopped him. How could she? She knew this was the only way to fix the mess they had made. But as much as she told herself it was for the best, it didn't stop the ache in her chest or the tears that wouldn't stop falling. Emily replayed every moment in her mind. The stolen glances, the accidental touches, the night she let him kiss her. She'd told herself it wasn't real, that it was just loneliness and desperation clouding her judgment. But deep down she knew the truth. It was real, and that terrified her. The days blurred together after that. Alex didn't come home. He sent a text, short and cold, telling her he needed time to think. Emily didn't argue. She knew she had no right to ask for forgiveness, no right to beg him to come back. Her nights were the hardest. The bed felt too big, too empty, and the silence in the house seemed louder than ever. She thought of Ryan constantly, wondering where he was, what he was thinking, if he hated her for pushing him away. But more than anything, she hated herself. She had destroyed everything, her marriage, her family, her sense of self, all because she let herself give in to something she should have fought harder to resist. One afternoon, Emily sat down and wrote a letter to Alex. She poured out everything, her guilt, her shame, her regrets. She told him how sorry she was, not just for what she had done but for letting their marriage fall apart in the first place. She didn't ask him to forgive her. She didn't think he ever could, but she asked him to move forward. Because no matter how much she wished she could change the past, she couldn't. and she knew now that she had to live with the consequences of her choices. As she sealed the envelope, Emily felt a strange sense of closure. It didn't erase what had happened, but it felt like the first step toward letting go. In the weeks that followed, Emily focused on rebuilding herself. She started therapy, forcing herself to confront the loneliness and insecurities that had driven her to make such a destructive choice. She didn't know if Alex would ever come back, or if she even wanted him to. For the first time, she had to face the reality of who she was without him. As for Ryan, she never saw him again. But sometimes in the stillness of the night, she thought of him, the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel. And she wondered if he thought of her too. But some doors once closed were never meant to be reopened. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done? Could you resist temptation, or would loneliness push you over the edge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another shocking story like this one. Trust me, the next one will leave you speechless.